Welcome to this video on Lawrence versus Texas, the 2003 Supreme Court case. We will be walking through a mock trial focused on the initial Harris County Criminal Court proceedings that preceded the landmark decision. Lawrence versus Texas began in 1998 at the Harris County Criminal Court. John Lawrence and Tyron Garner were charged with violating Texas's homosexual conduct statute. Although the case was initially dismissed as unconstitutional, this Houston courtroom action served as a vital precursor to the 2003 Supreme Court ruling. The core of the case involves an arrest following a false report of a weapons disturbance in Lawrence's apartment in September 1998. Officers claimed to observe Lawrence and Garner engaged in consensual sexual conduct and charged them under a statute criminalizing same-sex intimacy. This conflict pits private adult intimacy against state criminalization. The Texas statute, Section 21.06, criminalized same-sex intimacy in a private place. Both men pled not guilty, arguing the law violated their constitutional rights. They filed a motion to dismiss, leading to a hearing before the trial judge. Lawrence and Garner initially pled no contest to preserve their constitutional challenge. Though found guilty by the trial court, the case progressed through the Texas Court of Appeals and the Court of Criminal Appeals, eventually reaching the U.S. Supreme Court. The prosecution argued that the Texas legislature had statutory authority to enforce moral standards and cited the precedent of Bowers v. Hardwick. The state contended the law protected public morality and health and served as a deterrent against, quote, deviant behavior. The defense argued the law violated the fundamental right to privacy under the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. They also claimed it violated equal protection, as it only targeted same-sex conduct. They urged that the precedent of Bowers v. Hardwick should be overruled. This mock trial will explore the arguments and evidence presented at the initial trial level, which laid the groundwork for the future Supreme Court victory. We now turn to the specific arguments and witnesses presented during the trial phase of the Lawrence versus Texas case. The defense's theory rested on the Texas statute violating both the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses. They argued the police entry was unlawful, the state lacked a legitimate interest, and moral disapproval cannot justify criminal punishment for private consensual conduct. Professor Michael Green, a sociology of law expert, testified for the defense. His expert opinion focused on evolving social norms, arguing that the law no longer reflected modern community standards, which was crucial for the constitutional privacy analysis. Defendant John Lawrence testified about the circumstances surrounding the false police report and the subsequent arrest. He argued that the criminal statute violated his private life, centering his testimony on the right to adult intimacy. Tyron Garner also testified about the arrest's circumstances. His testimony reinforced the consensual, private nature of the activity, directly challenging the law's intrusion into private life. Next, we examine the arguments and witnesses presented by the state of Texas in the trial. The state's theory of the case argued that the statute reflected Texas's moral values, and that states have authority to regulate sexual conduct. They asserted the officers lawfully entered the apartment, and that the existing precedent, Bowers v. Hardwick, validated the convictions. Detective Marco Alvarez, the arresting officer, described the call and the entry. He emphasized that the officers observed obscene conduct in what he considered a publicly audible environment. His testimony was key to the state's factual backbone of the raid. Alvarez testified about responding to the false 911 call and his discovery of Lawrence and Garner. The defense countered that the police witnessed private, consensual activity. Dr. Evelyn Patel, a forensic nurse, performed the post-arrest medical exams. Her testimony for the state confirmed voluntary, intentional sexual activity. Crucially, her findings reinforced the consensual nature, supporting the defense's privacy claim. Dr. Patel's expert testimony confirmed the consensual, private, and harmless nature of the activity between the defendants, which provided neutral verification for the defense's arguments. Judge Jane R. Smith granted the motion to dismiss the charges, finding the statute violated the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. The ruling stated that adult, consensual conduct in private is a protected liberty interest, and moral disapproval is not a legitimate state interest. The trial judge ruled that the Texas statute was unconstitutional, protecting adult, consensual sexual conduct as a fundamental liberty interest. The state's lack of a legitimate non-moral interest led to the dismissal of all charges. The trial court's ruling recognized a protected liberty interest in private adult intimacy, asserting that moral disapproval is not a legitimate basis for criminal law. This decision was foundational, setting the stage for the landmark 2003 U.S. Supreme Court case. The subsequent Supreme Court majority established a broad liberty interest in private adult intimacy. They ruled that moral disapproval cannot be a legitimate state interest for criminalizing conduct and struck down all remaining U.S. sodomy laws, overruling Bowers v. Hardwick. The Supreme Court overturned the Texas sodomy law, affirming a liberty interest in private adult intimacy. This landmark decision ensured that moral disapproval alone is insufficient to justify criminalization and invalidated all similar laws nationwide. The 14th Amendment protects adult intimate relationships and private, consensual sexual conduct as part of liberty interests. The government cannot criminalize private moral choices based solely on moral disapproval. The constitutional impact of the ruling was significant, recognizing a liberty interest in private adult intimacy and confirming that moral disapproval is not a legitimate state interest for criminalizing conduct. The right to personal liberty, protected by the 14th Amendment, encompasses private, consensual adult sexual conduct. The government is restricted from criminalizing private, intimate relationships based on moral disapproval. Justice Scalia led the dissent, arguing that Bowers v. Hardwick was binding precedent and that the majority's decision lacked a rational constitutional basis, improperly interfering with traditional state laws. The Lawrence v. Texas case, originating in a Houston courtroom mock trial, fundamentally reshaped constitutional law regarding privacy and liberty rights.